5 days before this dog was scheduled to be euthanized, something impossible happened. The most violent canine in the shelter suddenly stopped barking the second Keanu Reeves walked in. But nobody knew why, until the earthquake trapped them both inside a collapsing building, and the dog everyone feared became the only reason Keanu survived. The paperwork had already been signed. 5 days remained before the most dangerous dog in the entire facility would be put down. For nearly 2 years, nobody had been able to control him. 3 staff members had been hospitalized. One had undergone reconstructive surgery after a violent attack that people inside the rescue still whispered about in lowered voices. The isolation ward at Pacific Shore K-9 Rescue had become a place employees avoided unless absolutely necessary. And yet, on that quiet afternoon in San Diego, something strange happened. For the first time in years, the dog went silent. Nobody understood why. Not until the motorcycle rolled slowly into the parking lot just after 2 in the afternoon. There were no bodyguards. No assistants. No black SUVs. Just a man in a faded leather jacket sitting alone on a motorcycle, staring at the building in front of him as though he had already visited this moment 100 times inside his own head. The sign above the entrance read Pacific Shore K-9 Rescue. The engine shut off. The silence afterward felt strangely heavy. The man removed his helmet slowly. It was Keanu Reeves. For a few seconds, he stayed seated on the bike without moving. His eyes rested on the shelter entrance while the California wind drifted through the parking lot carrying the distant sound of barking dogs. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a decision he had spent months trying to avoid. Ever since Duke died, his house in the hills no longer felt like home. The silence had changed. Not ordinary silence. The kind that presses against your chest at night. The kind that reminds you someone used to be there. Duke had slept beside his bed for years. Through long filming schedules. Through grief. Through nights where the world felt unbearably loud. The dog had always known when to move closer without being called. And when Duke died, the absence he left behind became its own presence. A hollow shape inside every room. Keanu finally stepped off the motorcycle. He walked toward the shelter doors. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, wet fur, old blankets, and something warmer underneath it all. Something alive. Dogs barked from every direction. Some scratched excitedly against kennel doors. Others simply watched. The woman at the front desk looked up and froze for half a second. She recognized him immediately. Her name tag read Sam Porter. Dark circles rested under her eyes in the familiar way they do on people who care too much about difficult jobs. "Mr. Reeves?" she asked carefully. He smiled softly. "Just Keanu." Sam nodded. "Right. Of course." She grabbed a clipboard and began guiding him down the main hallway. Dogs pressed against the kennel gates as they passed. A golden retriever wagged so hard his entire body shook. A nervous pit bull hid beneath a blanket. A shepherd mix stared silently from the corner of his kennel with eyes too old for his age. Sam introduced them one by one. "This one was abandoned outside Bakersfield. This one's great with kids. This one took weeks before he stopped flinching whenever someone raised their hand too quickly." Keanu listened quietly. He crouched beside several kennels, allowing the dogs to smell his hand. Some leaned into him immediately. Others hesitated. But none of them were the reason he had come. Something kept pulling him farther down the corridor. Toward the steel door at the very end. The atmosphere changed as they approached it. The lighting dimmed. The barking faded. Even Sam's voice became more careful. A warning sign hung beside the heavy reinforced door. "Restricted area. Staff only." Keanu noticed the way Sam subtly slowed her pace. Then the sound came. It exploded through the hallway like something breaking apart. Not a bark. Not exactly. It sounded deeper. Raw. Animal. Like pain given a voice. The steel door rattled from the impact. The noise echoed through the concrete corridor long after it ended. Keanu stopped walking. What's back there? Sam hesitated. Only for a moment. But it was enough. The isolation ward, she finally answered. Dogs that aren't available for adoption. Why not? Before she could answer, 2 employees stepped out of a side room nearby. They were talking quietly until they noticed Keanu standing there. One of them immediately fell silent. The other muttered nervously. Nearly bent the bars again this morning. 5 days left. The paperwork's already signed. The moment they realized Keanu had heard them, both quickly walked away. Keanu turned back toward Sam. 5 days? She exhaled slowly. His name is Shadow. Another violent bark slammed against the steel door behind her. Director Holloway scheduled euthanasia for the end of the week. Keanu said nothing. Sam continued. He's attacked 3 staff members. Nobody can get near him anymore. We've tried specialists, behavioral therapy, medication. Her voice softened. There's nothing left. The hallway became quiet again. Behind the steel door, Shadow stopped barking. And for some reason, the silence felt worse. Keanu looked directly at the reinforced entrance. Tell me about him. Sam studied him carefully before speaking. German Shepherd. 7 years old. Former police K9 from Portland. Her voice changed when she said the next part. He was one of the best they had. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while she explained. Shadow had worked explosive detection, tracking, suspect apprehension. He and his handler, Officer Daniel Reyes, had spent 5 years together. But the word together didn't sound professional when she said it. It sounded personal. Because it was. Daniel Reyes treated Shadow like family. Morning runs on the beach before shifts. Cookouts with the family. Late nights sitting beside the patrol car while the city slept. People at the department used to joke that Shadow listened to Daniel better than most humans listened to each other. Then came the warehouse. A routine narcotics operation. Or at least that's what the intelligence briefing claimed. It turned out to be an ambush. Gunfire erupted the moment officers entered the building. In the chaos, one of the gunmen aimed directly at Shadow. Daniel Reyes saw it. And without thinking, he stepped in front of his dog. The bullet entered his chest. He died on the warehouse floor. Shadow stayed beside the body for 4 hours. Officers later said the dog howled until his voice gave out completely. And when they finally pulled him away, something inside him never came back. Sam looked toward the steel door. He's been different ever since. The hallway felt colder now. Keanu stared at the door in silence. Then quietly said the words that changed everything. I want to see him. Sam blinked. Keanu. I don't think you understand how dangerous. I still want to see him. There was no arrogance in his voice. No recklessness. Just certainty. The kind that doesn't need volume. Sam looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly reached for her keycard. The lock clicked. The steel door opened. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, something began to growl. The isolation ward felt colder than the rest of the shelter. The moment the steel door closed behind them, the noise of the main facility disappeared. The cheerful barking. The clanging food bowls. The movement of volunteers. Everything faded. Only silence remained. Long concrete corridors stretched ahead beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Empty kennels lined both sides, most reinforced with additional steel bars. At the far end stood the final enclosure. 3 warning signs were bolted onto the wall beside it. Extreme aggression. Authorized personnel only. Do not enter without clearance. Sam slowed to a stop. Shadow stood in the darkness at the back of the kennel. Even from a distance, he looked enormous. Powerfully built. Black and tan fur dulled by years without proper sunlight. His body stayed perfectly still at first. Then he noticed them. The transformation happened instantly. The dog exploded forward. The speed was terrifying. His body slammed into the reinforced bars with enough force to shake the entire kennel. Teeth bared. Eyes wild. Growls ripping from deep inside his chest. Staff members farther down the corridor immediately grabbed tranquilizer poles. Someone shouted. "Step back." But Keanu didn't move. He simply stood there. Hands relaxed at his sides. Watching. Shadow lunged again. The impact echoed through the isolation ward. Another snarl. Another violent collision against steel. Years of fear, grief, rage, and abandonment crashing into metal bars over and over again. And then suddenly. The dog stopped. Not slowly. Immediately. Mid-growl. Mid-motion. His chest rose and fell heavily while his nostrils worked rapidly. Something had reached him. Something unfamiliar. He stared directly at Keanu. Not the staff. Not Sam. Keanu. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Everyone in the corridor noticed it. This wasn't how Shadow behaved. Normally, his aggression escalated until he exhausted himself completely. But now he simply stood there. Watching. Breathing. Trying to understand something. Then came the sound none of them had heard in nearly 2 years. A whine. Low. Soft. Trembling. Not anger. Not fear. Pain. The sound of something wounded remembering it once knew comfort. Sam's hand slowly covered her mouth. I've never heard him do that before. Keanu's expression tightened. He reached carefully into his jacket pocket. Shadow's eyes followed the movement. Slowly, Keanu pulled out an old leather dog collar. The leather had softened with age. The metal tag was scratched and worn. Duke's collar. He had carried it every single day since losing him. Shadow's nose twitched. The aggression in his posture shifted. Not gone. But confused. Searching. He stepped forward carefully until his muzzle touched the bars. Then he pressed his nose into Keanu's hand. And breathed. Long. Deep. Like he was reading a memory hidden inside the scent. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. The most dangerous dog in the facility stood motionless with his head resting against a stranger's hand. And for the first time in years, he looked tired instead of violent. Keanu looked at him quietly. Then whispered. Hey, buddy. Shadow's tail moved once. Only slightly. Barely enough to notice. But everyone saw it. And somehow, that tiny movement felt bigger than everything that came before it. Word spread through the facility within minutes. By the time Director Frank Holloway arrived at the isolation ward, nearly half the staff had gathered nearby pretending not to stare. Holloway was tall and sharp-featured, with silver threaded through his hair and exhaustion permanently carved into his face. He carried himself like a man who had spent decades making impossible decisions and living with them afterward. The moment he saw Keanu standing beside Shadow's kennel, his expression hardened. No. Keanu looked at him calmly. I want to go inside. No. Flat. Immediate. There's too much liability. Keanu nodded slightly. I understand. Then you understand this conversation is finished. Holloway turned toward the security guards nearby. Escort Mr. Reeves back to the public wing. The guards exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody moved. Keanu quietly walked to the wall beside the kennel. Then sat down on the floor. Holloway stared at him. What are you doing? Waiting. For what? For you to change your mind. You can't stay here. I'm not hurting anyone. Holloway's jaw tightened. I'll call the police. That's your right. One of the guards cleared his throat carefully. Sir, physically removing Keanu Reeves from an animal rescue during this situation might become. He hesitated. Complicated. Holloway looked like he wanted to argue with reality itself. Instead, he turned sharply and walked away. Keanu stayed where he was. Minutes passed. Then more. The isolation ward remained quiet except for the faint hum of emergency lighting. Shadow slowly approached the front of his kennel. Then, incredibly, laid down. His head rested between his paws while he watched Keanu sitting against the wall. No growling. No lunging. Just watching. Sam eventually found Holloway standing in his office near the window overlooking the corridor. Look at him, she whispered. Holloway didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the security camera feed. Shadow hadn't moved aggressively once. Not once. Finally, Holloway spoke quietly. Get the tranquilizer team ready. Sam blinked. And document everything. He exhaled heavily. If this goes wrong, I want it on record that I advised against it. Sam hurried back to the isolation ward. Keanu looked up as she approached. He agreed. For the first time that afternoon, a faint smile crossed his face. The staff quickly took positions. Tranquilizer rifles were prepared. Emergency medics stood nearby. Every person in the corridor braced themselves for disaster. Sam approached the kennel door. The lock disengaged with a loud metallic click. Shadow instantly rose to his feet. The old growl returned. Deep. Warning. His muscles tightened. Every instinct inside him screamed danger. The kennel door slowly swung open. And Keanu Reeves stepped inside. The entire corridor stopped breathing. The heavy steel door remained open behind him while staff members tightened their grip on tranquilizer rifles. Every eye stayed locked on Shadow. The German Shepherd stood motionless. Rigid. Tense. Conflicted. Years of instinct fought violently inside him. Trust nobody. Let nobody close. Push them away before they disappear. Keanu slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Not dramatically. Not carefully performed. Just naturally. He made himself smaller. Less threatening. His hands rested openly on his knees. Soft eyes. Quiet breathing. No sudden movements. He looked less like a celebrity standing before a dangerous animal and more like a tired man sitting beside another tired soul. Hey, Shadow. His voice barely carried beyond the kennel. I know you lost him. The growl faltered. Shadow's ears twitched. I lost mine too. Keanu slowly held out Duke's collar. The scent reached Shadow immediately. Everything changed. The aggression didn't disappear. But it cracked. Like ice beginning to split after holding pressure for too long. Shadow stepped forward carefully. Then another step. His nose lowered toward the worn leather collar. He inhaled deeply. The kennel became silent except for breathing. Keanu stayed completely still. Shadow looked directly into his eyes. Something passed between them in that moment. Not magic. Not instant healing. Recognition. The understanding shared only between creatures who know what loss feels like. Then Shadow closed the distance. Slowly. Carefully. And rested his head against Keanu's chest. Gasps echoed through the corridor. One of the staff members lowered his tranquilizer rifle without realizing it. Sam covered her mouth with both hands. Shadow remained pressed against him. Not aggressive. Not fearful. Just exhausted. Keanu carefully wrapped one arm around the dog's neck. Shadow trembled once. Then finally became still. For the first time in years, the dog looked safe. Not dangerous. Safe. Holloway stood frozen near the far end of the corridor. The certainty he had built his career on suddenly looked fragile. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to disturb the moment. Then the ground shook. At first, it felt distant. A faint vibration beneath the concrete floor. Several people frowned in confusion. Then came the second tremor. Stronger. Violent. The entire building lurched sideways. Lights flickered overhead. Emergency alarms exploded through the facility. Dogs everywhere began barking at once. A deep roaring sound rose beneath the structure itself. Earthquake, someone screamed. The ceiling cracked open. Concrete dust burst downward. Kennels rattled violently. A window shattered somewhere in the main building. The isolation ward security system activated automatically. Heavy steel doors slammed shut throughout the facility. The exit behind Keanu sealed closed like a vault. He and Shadow were trapped inside. Another violent tremor hit. Chunks of concrete crashed from the ceiling. One large piece struck the floor only feet away. The emergency lights failed. Darkness swallowed the ward except for the flickering orange glow of electrical sparks bursting from exposed wiring. Then came smoke. A fire had started. Keanu moved instantly. He pulled Shadow close and turned his body against the falling debris. A section of cracked concrete broke loose overhead. It slammed into Keanu's left leg. Pain exploded through him. He collapsed hard onto one knee. Blood quickly spread through torn denim below his knee. For a second, his vision blurred. Shadow immediately moved beside him. Whining. Alert. Focused. The dog wasn't panicking. He was assessing. Years of police training resurfaced beneath the trauma. Keanu forced himself to breathe. I'm okay. It wasn't entirely true. Smoke thickened around them. The fire along the wall spread rapidly through stacked supply boxes. Heat crawled through the room. They needed to move. Keanu looked toward the emergency exit across the isolation ward. Roughly 60 feet away. Might as well have been miles. He tried standing. His injured leg folded instantly. He hit the floor hard. Shadow barked sharply. Keanu gritted his teeth through the pain. Go. He pointed toward the exit. Shadow, go find help. The dog didn't move. Go. Instead, Shadow grabbed the sleeve of Keanu's jacket with his teeth. Then pulled. Keanu stared at him. The realization hit slowly. Shadow wasn't leaving him. Not again. Keanu grabbed the dog's collar. Using his good leg, he dragged himself forward while Shadow pulled with steady determination. Together they moved across the concrete floor. Slow. Painful. Relentless. Smoke dropped lower around them. Twice Keanu had to press his face near the floor just to breathe. Each time, Shadow stayed beside him. Waiting. Protecting. Working. The fire behind them grew louder. The heat became unbearable. Finally they reached the emergency exit. Keanu shoved against the heavy metal door. Nothing. The electronic lock system had failed shut. The door wouldn't open. Shadow immediately understood. The dog turned toward the door. Then barked. Not random barking. Not fear. This was precise. Rhythmic. Professional. The trained signal bark of a working police K9 guiding rescuers toward a trapped victim. Again. 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 Outside, in the evacuation zone beyond the damaged building, Sam froze. Amid sirens. Screaming alarms. Crumbling concrete. She heard it. That bark. And instantly understood what it meant. Her eyes widened. He found someone. Without hesitation, she ran back toward the collapsing shelter. Dust still drifted through the parking lot when Sam sprinted back toward the shelter entrance. Emergency responders shouted at her to stop. She ignored them. The aftershocks had weakened the structure further. Cracks spread across exterior walls like lightning frozen inside concrete. But somewhere inside that building, Shadow was still barking. And Keanu Reeves was trapped with him. Sam pushed through the emergency corridor. The inside of the shelter no longer looked familiar. Ceiling panels hung loose. Sprinkler systems sprayed water through clouds of dust. The floor tilted strangely beneath her feet. Every few seconds another distant crash echoed somewhere deeper inside the building. Then she heard it again. Bark. Pause. Bark. Precise. Controlled. A trained rescue signal. She followed the sound through smoke-filled hallways until she reached the emergency release panel beside the isolation ward exit. The glass covering the manual lever had cracked during the earthquake. Sam smashed the rest with her elbow. Pain shot through her arm. She grabbed the lever with both hands. Pulled hard. Metal locks disengaged inside the door. A second later the emergency exit burst open. Shadow emerged first. Still gripping Keanu's jacket sleeve. Pulling backward with his entire body. Keanu dragged behind him through smoke and debris. Blood covered one leg. Sam immediately dropped beside him. Together, she and Shadow pulled Keanu through the corridor. The air outside hit them all at once. Fresh. Cold. Real. Keanu collapsed onto the grass near the parking lot and lay there breathing hard while paramedics rushed toward him. Behind them, part of the isolation ward roof collapsed inward. The impact thundered across the facility. Dust exploded into the evening sky. Several people screamed. Shadow remained beside Keanu. Panting heavily. Watching him carefully. Not leaving even for a second. Paramedics cleaned the wound on Keanu's leg while emergency crews organized triage nearby. Sirens filled the air. Stretchers moved rapidly between injured staff members. Generators hummed. Firefighters shouted over radios. The entire rescue facility had become controlled chaos. Keanu sat against an equipment case while a medic wrapped his injured leg. Shadow rested beside him with his head against Keanu's knee. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Sam stood nearby counting evacuees. Again. And again. Each time she reached the same conclusion. One person missing. Her stomach tightened. Where's Holloway? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one of the younger staff members pointed toward the east wing. He went back inside before the second aftershock. Sam's face paled. Why? He said he needed something from his office. Silence fell. Then Shadow suddenly lifted his head. His ears moved forward. Nostrils flaring. Something had reached him. A scent. A sound. A trace buried beneath smoke and dust. Keanu noticed the shift instantly. Shadow rose to his feet. Focused. Alert. Working. Without hesitation, the dog sprinted across the parking lot toward the damaged east wing. Shadow, someone shouted. But he never slowed down. Keanu watched him disappear into the smoke. And said nothing. Because he understood exactly what the dog was doing. Inside the east corridor, the destruction was severe. A load-bearing wall had partially collapsed, crushing most of the hallway beneath concrete and twisted steel. Dust reduced visibility to almost nothing. Somewhere beyond the rubble, Holloway lay trapped. A slab of fallen wall pinned his legs beneath it. Blood ran down the side of his face from a head wound. His radio had fallen beyond reach. For 7 minutes he had shouted for help. And for 7 minutes, nobody heard him. Then movement appeared through the dust. Low. Fast. Silent. Shadow emerged from the haze. The dog immediately found Holloway. For a moment, neither moved. Holloway stared at him. This was the same animal he had ordered euthanized. The same dog he believed beyond saving. And now, trapped beneath a collapsed building, unable to move his legs, Holloway realized something horrifying. His life depended on that dog. Shadow stepped closer. Holloway closed his eyes briefly. Waiting. But the attack never came. Instead, Shadow turned toward the hallway entrance. And barked. Again. 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 Rhythmic. Precise. Calling rescuers directly toward the trapped man. The sound echoed through the ruined corridor like a beacon. For minutes later, rescue teams followed it through the rubble. Flashlights pierced the dust. Voices shouted. Then someone yelled. We found him. Emergency workers carefully lifted debris away while Shadow remained beside Holloway the entire time. He never moved. Never left. When crews finally pulled Holloway free and loaded him onto a stretcher, Shadow trotted beside them through the collapsing hallway and back into the evening light. The parking lot fell strangely quiet as they emerged. Holloway looked pale beneath the blood drying across his forehead. But he was alive. As medics lowered the stretcher near triage, Holloway slowly turned his head. Keanu sat nearby with his bandaged leg stretched out. Shadow walked directly toward him first. The dog settled beside him. Then looked back toward Holloway. The rescue director stared at Shadow for a very long time. He found me, Holloway whispered. His voice sounded different now. Softer. Like something inside him had shifted. Keanu nodded once. Holloway looked toward the darkening sky before speaking again. I had reports. He swallowed hard. I had injuries. Protocol. Documentation. Years of experience. His eyes returned to Shadow. And I was absolutely certain. Silence hung between them. The kind of silence people enter when certainty begins falling apart. Finally Holloway looked toward Sam. Cancel the euthanasia order. Her eyes widened. Immediately. He paused. Then quietly added the words nobody expected. And prepare the transfer paperwork. Keanu looked at him carefully. Holloway managed a tired breath. I think he already chose his home. 3 months later, Pacific Shore K-9 rescue reopened beneath clear California skies. The damaged wings had been rebuilt. Fresh paint covered cracked walls. New support beams reinforced the ceilings. The old isolation ward no longer looked like a prison. The steel barriers remained, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Natural light now poured through widened windows. Longer rehabilitation runs stretched behind the kennels. Quiet music drifted softly through the hallways. What had once been a place built around containment had slowly become a place focused on healing. News vans crowded the parking lot that morning. Cameras lined the entrance. Reporters gathered beneath temporary tents while volunteers rushed between folding chairs preparing for the reopening ceremony. At the center of it all stood Frank Holloway. He looked older than he had 3 months earlier. Not weaker. Just changed. The kind of change that comes after surviving something capable of rearranging a person from the inside. He stood behind the podium quietly reviewing handwritten notes before finally stepping toward the microphone. The crowd settled. Cameras lifted. Holloway looked out at the audience for several seconds before speaking. I built my career on the belief that some animals were beyond rehabilitation. His voice carried evenly through the courtyard. I had data to support that belief. Reports. Policies. Experience. He paused. And then the dog I scheduled for euthanasia saved my life. The silence that followed felt heavy. Real. Nobody moved. Holloway glanced briefly toward the front row. Shadow sat beside Keanu's chair. Calm. Alert. The same dog who once threw himself violently against reinforced steel bars now rested quietly beneath the morning sunlight. I spent years evaluating animals by their worst moments, Holloway continued. The problem is, worst moments are real. But they are not complete. Several people lowered their cameras. The speech no longer sounded corporate. It sounded personal. Holloway announced the Second Opportunity Initiative that morning. A rehabilitation partnership designed specifically for dogs labeled behaviorally unadoptable. Veterinary trauma specialists. Behavioral recovery programs. Structured therapy placement. Veteran support partnerships. The first-year goal alone could save hundreds of dogs from euthanasia. But while cameras focused on the podium, Keanu barely noticed any of it. His attention remained on Shadow. Because the truth was, bringing Shadow home had not magically fixed everything. Healing rarely works that way. The first few weeks in Los Angeles had been difficult. Shadow struggled with silence. At night he paced constantly through the house. Room to room. Hallway to hallway. Nails softly clicking against hardwood floors while the city slept outside. Sometimes he stopped suddenly in dark corners staring at nothing. Other nights low whimpers escaped him unconsciously, as if old memories had resurfaced somewhere beyond language. Keanu recognized the behavior immediately. The dog wasn't guarding the house. He was searching. Still trying to make sense of absence. Still waiting for someone who never came home. One night around 3 a.m, Keanu found Shadow sitting alone in the kitchen beneath dim refrigerator light. The dog's posture looked tense. Exhausted. Like he had spent hours fighting something invisible. Keanu didn't call his name. Didn't force affection. Didn't try to interrupt the moment. He simply lowered himself onto the kitchen floor beside him. And stayed there. No commands. No speeches. Just quiet presence. Eventually Shadow laid down beside him. Not touching. Just close enough to know he wasn't alone. That became their routine. Whenever Shadow paced, Keanu followed. If the dog stopped in the hallway, Keanu sat in the hallway. If he stared silently into dark rooms, Keanu stayed nearby until the moment passed. No pressure. No expectations. Only patience. Weeks slowly turned into something gentler. By the 5th week, Shadow no longer paced through every room. By the 7th, he started sleeping beside the bed instead of across the house. Some mornings, Keanu woke to find Shadow resting his chin quietly against the mattress edge, watching him with cautious eyes. Not fear. Not suspicion. Hope. A dangerous feeling for creatures who have lost too much. Then came the beach. Malibu. Early morning. The ocean stretching endlessly beneath pale sunrise light. Keanu unclipped the leash carefully. For several seconds Shadow simply stood there staring across the water. The breeze moved through his fur. Birds circled overhead. Waves crashed rhythmically against the shore. Then suddenly Shadow ran. Not cautiously. Not carefully. Full speed. Powerful legs tearing across wet sand while sunlight flashed against his coat. He chased seabirds with absolute seriousness despite having no intention of catching them. He barked once at the ocean itself as if offended by the existence of waves. And for the first time since Keanu had met him, Shadow looked free. Keanu stood farther down the beach watching quietly. Something loosened painfully inside his chest. A grief he had carried alone for too long finally shifted enough to breathe around. Duke's absence remained. It always would. But now, somehow, it no longer felt like the end of something. Only part of it. A few weeks later, Sam called. She had been working alongside a veterans therapy program through the San Diego VA Medical Center. Combat veterans. PTSD treatment. Group recovery sessions. "I need a favor," she told him over the phone. Keanu listened quietly. Then she said something that stayed with him. "I don't need a therapy dog," she explained. "I need Shadow specifically." The first visit happened on a Wednesday afternoon. No press. No cameras. Keanu parked in the regular visitor lot. Shadow walked beside him through the hospital corridors with calm focus. Patients looked up as they passed. Some smiled. Others simply watched silently. The therapy session took place inside a quiet common room overlooking the parking structure. Several veterans sat scattered throughout the room speaking softly with counselors. Some interacted with therapy animals. Others avoided eye contact completely. Shadow moved slowly through the space. Reading people. Observing. Then he stopped. Near the far window sat a man named Thomas. Former Army. 2 overseas deployments. According to staff, he had barely spoken during 5 months of treatment. Every day he sat beside the same window staring outside for hours. Shadow walked directly toward him. Past everyone else. Then quietly laid down at his feet. Thomas didn't react immediately. Minu. Thomas didn't react immediately. Minutes passed. The room continued around them. Conversations. Soft music. The distant hum of hospital machinery. Then slowly, Thomas lowered one hand onto Shadow's head. His shoulders dropped. A tiny movement. But meaningful. Like tension finally releasing after years held too tightly. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded rough from disuse. "He doesn't need me to explain anything." The room became still. Thomas stared quietly at the dog resting beside him. He already knows. Across the room, Keanu looked down for a moment. Because he understood exactly what Thomas meant. Some pain cannot be translated into words. Sometimes being understood without explanation becomes its own kind of rescue. Walking back toward the parking lot afterward, Shadow stayed close beside him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Keanu reached down absently, scratching behind the dog's ears. Shadow immediately leaned his full body weight into the touch. He always did that. Like he needed people to physically feel his trust. Keanu smiled faintly. Then looked toward the horizon where the ocean shimmered beyond the city. And for the first time in a very long time, home no longer felt empty. The veterans program changed Shadow in ways nobody expected. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Healing almost never announces itself while it's happening. It arrives quietly. In smaller reactions. Softer breathing. Longer moments of calm. The absence of fear where fear used to live. Every other Wednesday, Keanu drove Shadow down to San Diego. No public appearances. No interviews. Most people inside the VA barely realized who Keanu Reeves actually was because he never behaved like a celebrity once he walked through those hospital doors. He carried coffee. Helped move chairs. Sat quietly in corners during group sessions. And mostly, he watched Shadow work. Because that was the only word that truly fit. Work. Shadow moved through emotional pain with the focus of a trained officer still carrying out a mission. He always seemed to know who needed him most. Sometimes it was obvious. A veteran shaking through panic attacks. Someone isolated from the group. Someone staring too long at nothing. Other times it was harder to explain. A subtle tension. A silence beneath another silence. And somehow Shadow found it every single time. One rainy afternoon, a former Marine named Caleb arrived for his first session. He looked angry before anyone even spoke to him. Arms crossed. Jaw tight. Eyes constantly scanning exits. The counselors later explained he had walked out of 3 separate treatment programs before finishing intake. Nobody expected him to stay long. He sat alone near the back wall while the session began around him. Shadow watched him from across the room. Then slowly stood. The German Shepherd crossed the room without hesitation and stopped directly in front of Caleb. The man immediately stiffened. "I'm not really a dog person," he muttered. Shadow ignored the words. Instead, he quietly sat down. Waiting. Caleb looked uncomfortable. Then irritated. Then strangely emotional. Because the dog wasn't demanding anything. No tricks. No expectations. No judgment. Just presence. Finally Caleb exhaled shakily. "You remind me of mine." The room stayed silent. Caleb stared at the floor. "He died while I was overseas." His voice cracked unexpectedly. "I didn't even get to say goodbye." Shadow slowly rested his head against the man's knee. And just like that, something inside Caleb broke open. Not violently. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way frozen things begin melting when warmth finally reaches them. Keanu watched the moment from across the room. And once again found himself thinking about Duke. About loyalty. About grief. About how dogs somehow understand emotional truths humans spend entire lifetimes trying to explain. That evening, after the session ended, Keanu and Shadow walked slowly along the beach south of the pier. The tide rolled quietly beneath fading sunlight. Shadow stayed close beside him, occasionally brushing against his leg while seabirds drifted overhead. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and removed Duke's old collar. The leather had become softer with age. The metal tag scratched nearly smooth. For months after Duke died, Keanu carried it because letting go felt impossible. Now, standing beside the ocean with Shadow resting nearby, the collar felt different in his hand. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just, complete somehow. Like grief had stopped being an open wound and slowly become part of the landscape instead. Shadow nudged his hand gently. Keanu smiled. "You would have liked him," he whispered. The dog's ears twitched. The waves continued rolling toward shore. Steady. Endless. As the months passed, stories about Shadow quietly spread beyond the rescue. Not exaggerated stories. Real ones. Veterans sleeping through the night for the first time in years after therapy sessions. Formerly aggressive shelter dogs improving through rehabilitation methods developed around Shadow's recovery. Police departments reaching out for consultation instead of automatic euthanasia recommendations. People began traveling from different states to observe the Second Opportunity Initiative firsthand. Even Holloway changed. The transformation surprised everyone most. Before the earthquake, he had built his entire professional identity around risk assessment, containment, procedure. Now he spent hours inside rehabilitation spaces quietly observing animals others had already given up on. One afternoon, Sam found him sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a terrified Doberman that refused to leave the back corner of its kennel. Holloway looked deeply uncomfortable, but patient. The dog watched him nervously. Neither moved. Sam smiled faintly from the doorway. "You're getting better at this." Holloway glanced toward her. "I'm trying to learn the difference between danger and pain." The sentence stayed with her long after he said it. By winter, Shadow had become inseparable from Keanu. He followed him everywhere. Coffee shops. Morning rides. Late-night walks through Malibu when insomnia kept sleep far away. And slowly, little pieces of Shadow's personality began resurfacing beneath the trauma. He became obsessed with squirrels. Not violently. Personally. Like he considered their existence offensive on principle. There was also a woman named Elena who operated a small coffee cart near the beach path. Shadow adored her. Nobody knew why. Maybe because she always carried treats in her apron pocket. Maybe because she greeted him before greeting customers. Maybe because some people simply radiate safety. Every morning she leaned over the counter smiling. "There's my handsome boy." Shadow's tail immediately started wagging. Keanu would stand nearby holding coffee while watching the interaction with quiet amusement. "You know he only comes here for the treats, right?" Elena teased. Shadow barked once as if offended by the accusation. Keanu laughed softly. The sound surprised even him sometimes. Not because he had forgotten how to laugh. Because he had forgotten how natural it could feel. But healing isn't linear. Some nights still became difficult. Very difficult. The nightmares never disappeared completely. Certain sounds triggered Shadow instantly. Sirens. Sudden metallic crashes. Fireworks in the distance. Whenever it happened, the dog woke violently from sleep. Panting. Eyes wide. Body rigid with remembered fear. Keanu never tried forcing him back to sleep. Never raised his voice. Never punished the panic. Instead, he sat beside him on the floor. Sometimes for hours. One hand resting gently against Shadow's back while the dog slowly returned from whatever memory had trapped him. And eventually, every single time, Shadow settled. Because he had learned something new. The person beside him stayed. That realization changed everything. Not only for Shadow. For Keanu too. Because somewhere along the way, while teaching a broken dog how to trust the world again, Keanu realized the dog had quietly been teaching him the exact same thing. Winter arrived quietly along the California coast. Cold ocean wind drifted through Malibu at night carrying the sound of distant waves and rustling palm trees. Most evenings, Keanu and Shadow settled into a peaceful routine. Long walks. Late coffee. Quiet television nobody actually watched. For the first time in years, life had begun feeling stable. But trauma has a way of waiting patiently beneath calm moments. And some memories never truly disappear. They only sleep. The call came just after midnight. Keanu answered groggily while Shadow lifted his head from the living room rug. It was Sam. Her voice sounded tight. Controlled. Which somehow made it worse. There's been an incident. Keanu sat upright immediately. At the rescue? Yes. In the background he heard shouting. Sirens. Metal doors slamming. His stomach tightened. What happened? Sam hesitated. Then quietly said the words. One of the new rehabilitation dogs escaped containment after a panic response. 2 staff members were injured trying to restrain him. Keanu looked toward Shadow. The dog was already standing. Watching him. Alert. He's asking for Shadow, Sam added. Who is? Holloway. 45 minutes later, Keanu's motorcycle pulled into the rescue parking lot. Red and blue emergency lights flashed across the building. Several employees stood outside speaking rapidly while paramedics treated an injured handler near the entrance. The atmosphere felt tense. Fearful. Keanu removed his helmet and immediately noticed something else. The staff weren't just afraid of the escaped dog. They were afraid history was repeating itself. Inside the facility, Holloway met them near the intake corridor. His face looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. What happened? Keanu asked. Holloway rubbed both hands over his face. Belgian Malinois. Former military contract dog named Titan. The name alone sounded heavy. He was transferred in 2 weeks ago after a failed euthanasia recommendation. Shadow remained perfectly still beside Keanu. Listening. He's highly trained, Holloway continued. Explosives detection. Apprehension. Multiple combat deployments overseas. Keanu already understood where this was going. His handler? Killed during an IED attack. Silence. The similarities settled heavily into the room. He hasn't adjusted well, Holloway admitted. That's an understatement, one employee muttered nearby. Holloway ignored him. Tonight another dog barked unexpectedly during feeding rounds. Titan panicked. The staff attempted physical restraint. And? He fought his way out. The rescue director looked exhausted. Right now he's barricaded himself inside the Old East Rehabilitation Wing. Keanu frowned. Is he attacking people? No. That answer surprised him. Holloway continued carefully. He's attacking anyone who tries getting close. There was a difference. A very important one. One officer nearby shook his head. We've got animal control on standby, he said quietly. Keanu understood exactly what that meant. Shadow slowly looked toward the hallway leading deeper into the facility. Focused. Listening. Then came the sound. A deep bark echoed from somewhere inside the east wing. Not rage. Fear. Keanu felt Shadow tense beside him. The German shepherd's ears moved forward. Recognition passed through him instantly. Not of the specific dog. Of the pain. Keanu glanced toward Holloway. Take us to him. The East Rehabilitation Corridor looked dim beneath emergency lighting. Most of the wing remained under renovation after earthquake damage months earlier. Plastic sheeting covered unfinished walls while exposed wiring hung from open ceiling panels. At the far end of the hallway stood Titan. Massive. Lean. Powerfully built. The Belgian Malinois paced frantically near a shattered kennel gate. His movements looked sharp and military precise even through the panic. The moment he saw people approaching, his body stiffened. A violent growl rolled from deep inside his chest. Several staff members instinctively stepped backward. Shadow did not. The 2 dogs stared at each other across the corridor. Titan barked explosively. Shadow remained calm. Still. Watching. Then something remarkable happened. Shadow slowly sat down. No aggression. No challenge. No dominance. Just calm. Titan's growling faltered slightly. The Malinois paced again. Faster this time. Conflicted. Keanu quietly understood what Shadow was doing. He wasn't confronting Titan. He was communicating. You're safe. Nobody here wants to hurt you. Titan barked again. But weaker now. Less certain. Shadow lowered himself further until he was lying calmly on the floor. The transformation inside Titan became visible almost immediately. His pacing slowed. His ears shifted uncertainly. The rage inside him no longer had something to fight. Keanu slowly crouched beside Shadow. The entire hallway stayed silent. Nobody dared interrupt what they were witnessing. Titan took one hesitant step forward. Then stopped. His breathing remained rapid. Eyes wide. Body tense. But he no longer looked violent. He looked terrified. And suddenly everyone in that corridor understood something important. Aggression and fear often wear the exact same face. Titan whimpered softly. The sound barely reached them. Shadow stood again. Then carefully approached. Slow. Measured. No sudden movement. The Malinois froze. For several seconds neither dog moved. Then Titan lowered his head. Just slightly. A surrender. Not to dominance. To safety. Shadow closed the final distance and touched his nose gently against Titan's shoulder. The younger dog visibly trembled. And then completely collapsed onto the floor. Not physically. Emotionally. Months of fear poured out of him all at once. Whining. Shaking. Exhausted. Shadow stayed beside him quietly. No force. No restraint. Just understanding. Several staff members nearby looked stunned. One woman wiped tears from her eyes. Holloway stared silently at the two dogs. Then slowly spoke beneath his breath. We almost killed another one. Keanu looked toward him. Holloway's eyes never left Titan. That used to be my first instinct, he admitted quietly. Contain the threat. Eliminate the risk. He swallowed hard. But maybe some creatures don't need punishment. His voice softened. Maybe they need someone who understands why they're afraid. Shadow remained lying beside Titan while the younger dog's breathing gradually slowed. The entire corridor felt different now. Softer somehow. Like fear itself had finally loosened its grip. Later that night, after the facility settled, Keanu stood alone outside near the parking lot watching fog drift across the coastline. Shadow rested nearby beneath a street lamp while Titan slept inside the rehabilitation wing for the first time since arriving. Sam stepped beside him quietly. You know what scares me? She asked. Keanu glanced toward her. How close we came to making the same mistake twice. The wind moved softly through the parking lot. Keanu looked toward Shadow. The German Shepherd lifted his head slightly before settling again. Pain changes people, Keanu said quietly. Sam nodded. And dogs. He smiled faintly. Yeah. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Sam looked toward the shelter windows glowing softly against the night. I think he's changing all of us. Keanu followed her gaze. Inside the rehabilitation wing, Shadow still lay beside Titan. Guarding him. Teaching him. Showing another broken animal the thing nobody had once shown him. You don't have to survive alone anymore. By February, the story had spread far beyond California. Not because anyone aggressively promoted it, but because certain stories travel on their own. A former police dog scheduled for euthanasia saves a man during an earthquake. A broken animal helps veterans recover from trauma. A shelter once known for behavioral failures becomes a national rehabilitation model. People needed stories like that. Especially now. The American Hero Dog Award ceremony took place in Washington, D.C. beneath crystal chandeliers and soft golden lighting. Nearly 400 people filled the auditorium that evening. Veterans. Animal rescue workers. Police officers. Families. Reporters. People from every corner of the country gathered to celebrate animals who had changed human lives. But when Shadow's name was announced, something unusual happened. The audience stood up before Keanu even reached the stage. Applause thundered through the auditorium. Not polite applause. Emotional applause. The kind people give when they're clapping for something larger than a single moment. Keanu walked slowly toward the podium with Shadow beside him. The German Shepherd remained calm despite the lights, cameras, and crowd. Only his ears moved occasionally as he observed the room. Keanu rested one hand gently against Shadow's back while the applause continued. For a second, he looked overwhelmed. Not by attention. By meaning. Finally the room quieted. Keanu leaned toward the microphone. I came to that shelter because I thought I was helping a dog. His voice stayed soft. Honest. But that's not what happened. Silence filled the auditorium. Then the applause returned even louder than before. Keanu stepped back from the microphone almost immediately. No dramatic speech. No performance. Just truth. But the moment everyone remembered afterward happened several minutes later. A woman slowly stood from the front row. She looked to be in her 60s. Silver threaded through her dark hair. Her movements carried the careful heaviness of someone holding fragile memories close to her chest. The room gradually became quiet as she walked toward the stage. Nobody stopped her. Nobody needed to. Something about the moment already felt important. Keanu recognized her first. Rosa Reyes. Daniel Reyes' mother. Shadow noticed her next. The German Shepherd immediately rose to his feet. His ears pushed forward. His breathing changed. Recognition. Not visual. Something deeper. A scent. A memory. Rosa slowly knelt before him at center stage. The massive auditorium had become completely silent. She placed trembling hands gently against both sides of Shadow's face. And the tears arrived before the words did. You stayed with him. Her voice broke instantly. But she kept going. You stayed with my son until the end. Several people in the audience lowered their heads. Others openly cried. Rosa pressed her forehead softly against Shadow's. I needed to thank you for that. Her voice trembled harder now. I needed you to know, he wasn't alone. The sentence shattered halfway through. Shadow moved closer immediately. Gently. Carefully. He pressed his muzzle against her cheek exactly the same way he once pressed it against Keanu inside the isolation kennel. Offering comfort. Offering presence. Offering whatever remained inside him that still knew how to love despite everything he had lost. Rosa wrapped both arms around his neck. Shadow leaned into her completely. Steady. Warm. Safe. The entire auditorium remained silent. Not awkward silence. Sacred silence. The kind people instinctively protect because words would only damage it. Keanu stood nearby watching quietly. His eyes filled. But he never interrupted the moment. Some grief deserves space. And some healing belongs entirely to the people inside it. After the ceremony, reporters crowded the lobby hoping for interviews. Keanu avoided most of them. That night wasn't about publicity. It belonged to Shadow. Later, back at the hotel, Shadow rested beside the window overlooking Washington's glowing skyline. The city lights reflected softly in the glass. Keanu sat nearby loosening his tie while exhaustion slowly settled into his body. For a long time neither moved. Then Keanu quietly reached toward the collar around Shadow's neck. New leather. Strong. Simple. On the inside of the tag, engraved in small lettering, were words he had added shortly after bringing Shadow home. What broke us doesn't have to be all we are. Not a quote for cameras. Not a slogan, just the closest thing to truth he had discovered. Shadow lifted his head slightly as Keanu scratched behind his ears. Outside the hotel window, snow began falling softly over the city. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them looked haunted anymore. Spring returned slowly to California. The ocean warmed. Tourists filled the beaches again. And life, as it always does, kept moving forward. But some stories leave permanent marks on the people who survive them. The Second Opportunity Initiative exceeded every expectation during its first year. More than 300 dogs once considered dangerous or unadoptable entered rehabilitation instead of euthanasia. Some joined families. Others entered therapy programs. Several became search and rescue animals. And a few eventually returned to law enforcement beside handlers specifically trained in trauma recovery. The ripple effect spread quietly across the country. Shelters began re-evaluating behavioral euthanasia procedures. Police departments requested consultations. Veterinary conferences studied the rehabilitation model developed at Pacific Shore. And everywhere the same question slowly emerged. What if some animals weren't broken? What if they were grieving? Frank Holloway spoke at a National Animal Welfare Conference in Chicago that spring. Standing beneath bright conference lights in front of hundreds of shelter directors, he looked uncomfortable in the way deeply honest people often do. For years, he had built policies around certainty. Now he spoke openly about doubt. I used to make decisions based entirely on worst-case outcomes, he admitted. And sometimes those outcomes were necessary to consider. The room remained silent. But pain can look exactly like aggression if you stop listening too early. Several people in the audience immediately began writing. Holloway paused before adding quietly. I wish I had learned that sooner. Back in Malibu, Shadow lived the kind of ordinary life nobody once believed possible. He slept on the couch whenever he thought Keanu wasn't paying attention. Keanu always noticed. He just pretended not to. Morning beach walks became routine. So did coffee stops with Elena near the boardwalk. Every single time she greeted Shadow Phi, his tail instantly wagged. Keanu would shake his head. You've completely ruined him. Elena laughed. He deserves it. And honestly, she was right. Shadow still hated squirrels with intense personal conviction. He still occasionally woke from nightmares. And during thunderstorms, he stayed unusually close beside Keanu throughout the night. But the fear no longer controlled him. That was the difference. One evening near sunset, Keanu and Shadow returned to the beach south of the pier. The same beach where Shadow first ran free months earlier. The sky burned orange across the horizon while waves rolled steadily toward shore. People gradually drifted home as darkness approached. Soon the beach became quiet. Only ocean, wind, and the distant sound of gulls. Keanu sat down in the sand. Shadow slowly lowered himself beside him, resting his head across Keanu's knee. For a while neither moved. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt earned. Keanu removed Duke's old collar from his jacket pocket. He still carried it. Maybe he always would. The leather looked weathered now from years of handling. He turned it over thoughtfully beneath fading sunlight. Then reached down, touching the collar around Shadow's neck. Past. Present. Loss. Healing. All connected somehow. Keanu looked toward the horizon where the final edge of sunlight disappeared beneath the ocean. Duke would have liked you, he said softly. Shadow's ears twitched. His eyes remained half-closed. Peaceful. The stars slowly appeared overhead one at a time. Tentative at first. Then brighter. More certain. The beach emptied completely around them. Still, neither moved. Because some moments don't need improving. The ocean continued its endless rhythm against the shore. And there beneath the darkening California sky sat a man and a dog who had once believed grief would define the rest of their lives. But grief had changed shape. Not disappeared. Never disappeared. Just softened enough to carry. Somewhere behind them, the world continued rushing forward. Traffic. Headlines. Noise. But out there beside the water, none of it mattered. What mattered was simpler. A dog once considered too dangerous to save had saved countless lives instead. A man who came searching for companionship found healing he never expected. And somewhere in the quiet space between loss and love, both of them finally found their way home. The waves rolled forward. Then back again. Steady. Endless. Like forgiveness. Like memory. Like second chances.